And for our second presentation, we have EJ Milner-Gulland from the University of Oxford to talk about how we improve our methods for generating evidence.
It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to Bill and his colleagues for inviting me. And I hope this will be a really nice complementary talk to the previous one, because it's coming from a kind of academic perspective, I guess, rather than the practitioner perspective, and from a social science perspective, rather than a biological science perspective. So this is the topic that Bill gave me, a nice, narrow, focused topic there. And when I saw that topic, the questions that came to my mind immediately were these three. So evidence of what, for what purpose, and who's going to use that evidence. So I'm just going to start by illustrating the answers to those questions for three things that have been done in my group recently. So the first one is about protected areas in northern Cambodia, done by Tom Clements, who works at the Wildlife Conservation Society. So there he was interested in whether protected areas were improving people's well-being in order to inform changes to that particular intervention that he was running, but also international conservation practice. And it would be used in the site itself. And this one followed a very strict impact evaluation framework, so quite a complicated technical design in which he could look over 3 years using a before-after control intervention framework, matching his sites with control sites and following people over time. The kinds of evidence you get out of that are things like this, where you can see the effect size of different payment schemes on people's well-being, whether they were making them poorer or richer, compared to matched controls. The second one is very, very different. So this was done by Alegria de Castro, looking at whether demand reduction campaigns that have been going on for rhino horn in Viet Nam, are the NGOs following the best practice of social marketing design. And the idea was to improve future design of these initiatives and hoping that it would be used by NGOs in the wildlife trade and conservation scientists. And this was a very different approach. So there she was doing open-ended interviews with the implementers of these interventions. She was using grounded theory, which is a very kind of bottom-up approach where you let the data that you get from the interviews inform your theory about what's going on. And she used that to develop this thing she called a demand reduction wheel, which is really just a set of stages in the design, implementation, and monitoring of an intervention, and then populated with data from her interviews to show where people were doing things. And you can see there that very few people had indicators of success, very few people had measures of objectives, and lots of people were doing stuff. Third example is an ongoing project that's being run by Henry Travers, along with the Uganda Wildlife Authority and other partners. And there the evidence is about what combinations of benefit-sharing approaches local people preferred. And that was done in order that the Uganda Wildlife Authority could improve their offering of benefit sharing to local communities. And hopefully we're going to Uganda next week to talk about the Uganda Wildlife Authority's response to that. And that was mixed methods, mostly behavioural economics, so a huge range of different approaches to try and understand people's preferences, including key informant interviews, choice experiments, scenario analyses. And the kind of evidence you get there is prevalence estimates for different kinds of illegal activities in wildlife parks, and then a huge range of different ways in which these interventions might affect people's behaviour and their preferences, depending on likelihood informing, community preference, preference by the rangers themselves. So I hope you see that those are three very different situations. One of them is an impact evaluation, one of them is more in terms of adaptive management, and one of them is predicting and designing interventions for the future. So they might have different kinds of evidence generated in different ways. And then you get various kinds of more logistical, administrative things like, do you have the capacity and the budget to use a certain kind of method rather than another? Do you want to attribute your impact? So do you want some kind of causation, or are you happy with correlation? You get very different kinds of methods if you want to do that. Are you interested in objective measurements? So fact that might be used by external funders, or are you interested in people's perceptions? Subjective evidence about how people actually feel about the interventions that are being imposed upon them. Are you interested in the mechanisms by which things work, or more like Tom Clements' thing at the beginning, are you more interested in the effect size? So how much has well-being improved as a result of this intervention? And all these things need to be taken into account when you think about methods. Okay, so for the next 15 minutes, I could tell you a load of methods, but I'm not going to. Instead, I'm going to give you some thoughts from me about where we're going with methods. So what are some of the really interesting new developments that are on the horizon that I think we, as practitioners, scientists, should be using more? So the first one I thought was about participatory research. Now, everybody talks about participatory research all the time nowadays, but what I'm talking about here is truly participatory research. So research that is done because the end users want it, it's designed by the end users, facilitated by scientists, rather than designed by scientists. And this is a really nice example of that, which is the Excites program at UCL. And these guys are working with Cameroonian pygmy tribes, illiterate people, and yet they're developing and then using these new technologies. So new technology is the way to actually be able to do this. And they're generating evidence of the type that they want in order to help them to negotiate properly with logging companies, as it happens. So that map, which was generated by these guys and downloaded by people in the village onto the laptop, then produced a GIS-based thing, which showed the important sites for those people within the logging concessions that people could then avoid when they were doing their logging. That's one kind of participatory research. The other kind of truly participatory research is this kind of thing that was highlighted by Steve Redpath and colleagues about human-wildlife conflict. So here, this is a very complicated graphic, which is about how do you identify and then address issues of conflict, tricky ones like, for example, he works a lot on hen harriers and grouse shooting. What's interesting here is that the green is the ecological evidence. So this is where ecologists can feed in their scientific evidence. And then the red is social evidence, so from social scientists. And you can see that that evidence is then embedded within a complex matrix of stakeholder processes. So your evidence doesn't stand alone. So in order to be able to do that, you need a kind of transdisciplinary approach. You need an approach in which science is actually part of the process from the design right the way through the implementation to the monitoring. And this requires a change of mindset, both from the scientists and from the end users that they're going to be working together. It also, as Georgina said, requires a change of mindset for the scientists in terms of what kinds of papers they might be publishing, because this kind of work doesn't produce you the high-impact, exciting, new kind of work that is going to get you into the big journals. It'll produce something that's useful, but not necessarily novel and groundbreaking. Okay, so that's the first one. The second kind of new horizon, I think, is perhaps an old horizon, but it's about the use of modelling. So I guess I still count myself really as a modeller, and I think that models are woefully underappreciated within science and policy practice. And partly that's the fault of the modelers, because a lot of models that you see within conservation science don't really go far enough towards something that could be used by practitioners. We tend to stop at the heuristics, at the kind of generalities, and we tend not to go far enough. And also, we tend not to present our models in papers in a way that anyone can actually understand what we're talking about who aren't also modelers. But there has been moves towards modelling being much more embedded in a participatory process. And one really kind of shining example of that is these guys. So it's a group of fisheries scientists in Australia, led by Kathy Dickmont and Beth Fulton as well, who use, I like what they call a simple model, so a Bayesian belief network, that's just a little thing. So they have these models embedded within processes in which actually they're working with fishes in a participatory way to populate, structure, and then use those models to think about solutions. Okay, so here's really a nice example of, firstly, the kinds of models that are actually presented in papers that wouldn't be read by a practitioner, but also actually a really, really interesting case study. So this was done by Katrina Shea et al. About foot and mouth, and there the issue was, if you look at A, was there were 3 different potential parameter values for the dispersal rate of foot and mouth disease in the UK. So she's there showing how different strategies of culling, which were really important for the UK agriculture industry, which one you would choose under different model weights, and then how different cases of foot and mouth would then inform which way you are. So it would give you the likelihood of one model being true over another, and then that top one there is an estimate of the value of the information, so the degree to which finding out new data would actually save you money. I'm not going to go into any more of it, but it's a really nice bit of work. Okay, number 3, I think we need to think more predictively. So we need to think in a way that's actually designing things for the future and trying to predict for the future. So here's a kind of fairly standard adaptive management cycle. Everyone's seen it before. You know, you understand the system, you make predictions, you use those predictions to implement in the real world, you monitor, and then you understand the system better. But I think the prediction side of it isn't always done as best it can be. So within social science, you can use behavioural economics, scenario building, that kind of thing to think about what the future might be. You can then put that into models, agent-based models, management strategy evaluation, where you're comparing different approaches to management in a virtual world. You can then put that into the real world through adaptive management, monitor, address your key uncertainties, and go back through again. So I think, you know, there's a roles for science all the way through that framework, and it needs to be designed in order that you can learn and that you can then use that learning to adapt your management. And that's a different kind of science practice interface than what we usually have at the moment. I think being predictive is one way to get better towards that. And here's one example. So this was done in Cambodia, and we were asking local people about how different changes in external factors like the price of cassava and also in conservation interventions of various kinds, that's what those are, would change their land management practices. So would they increase or decrease their clearance under different combinations of external factors? Doesn't really matter what they said, apart from that prices are much more important than conservation. Next one. Let's be more experimental. I think we're being much less experimental than we should be. So, for example, you can go right the way to the World Bank randomized controlled trials, and randomized controlled trials are barely used in conservation. I think actually we should be more imaginative and we should think a bit harder about that, because I think there are places where we can use randomized controlled trials. But even if we're not doing that, we can still have experiments and controls. So here's a nice bit of work by Matt Linke et al. Looking at Indonesian orangutan crop damage around a national park. And what he was doing was he was assigning farms to different kinds of conflict mitigation measure, noise trials, net trials, and controls. And by doing that, he got a much better understanding of which approaches work and which ones don't, than just going in and having a go without thinking about controls. And the final one, for me, is about sharing. So new ways of sharing. And I think, again, new technology, internet, is really helping us to share in better, more imaginative ways. So we need to have communities of practice where practitioners and academics can talk in a better way than's been going on at the moment. So, for example, jointly generated manuals, guidance for best practice that are written by both sides, and also actually by funders as well. This kind of thing like what IIED is doing, where people have an online community where they're sharing experience, sharing best practice, and in that way the science can get more closely towards people. Okay, so those are my kind of 5 new horizons, new ways in which we could improve our methods so that they're more relevant. Now I'm just going to come back to something that was mentioned yesterday as well, which is about social science. So I confess I come from a naturalish science background, and I'd sort of see myself nowadays as perhaps more of a social scientist. But when you think about social science, just as you think about natural science, it's not one great blob. So I've talked a lot to anthropologists and I've talked a lot to economists, and their worldviews are massively different. So the kinds of methods, the kinds of approaches, the whole philosophies that underlie your science are very, very different if you're an anthropologist compared to an economist. And you have to be aware of that when you're thinking about these kinds of methods. I've also sat in a lot of rooms talking about interdisciplinarity and how to make it work and how not to make it work. And I've had people saying, well, basically what you do in your undergraduate degree defines you for the rest of your life. You can never be social scientists, guys. Bad luck. I just don't think that's true. I think on the one side, we've got situations where natural scientists, so conservation biologists trained in natural science, go out and they do a nice, I don't know, line transect survey looking for duikers in the forest. And then they think, I know, let's go and do a survey of the local people and see what they think about duikers. We'll stick that onto the end of our transect, that won't be a problem. So they go off and they do some survey, and then they wonder why people don't really take it seriously. But can you imagine an economist doing a household survey around the protected area and then going in and doing a line transect for duikers as a little extra thing? You'd be appalled. You'd just think, what is this guy doing? Or gal. So don't think that just because it seems easy to do a household survey, it really is. I think we need to be careful that there is some technical expertise. But on the other hand, we can learn it. So I think if we feel that we really need to do something, that it's really going to matter to us, and that we get the right experience, we get the right training from people who actually know what's going on, we too can become drug kingpins, aka social scientists. So let's not give up. So to summarise, the 5 things that I thought were important were, first of all, embracing truly participatory research, using the new methods that there are so that people are genuinely involved in that, using a range of different methods, but I think models are underappreciated, being predictive, being experimental, and sharing in new innovative ways. So that might seem like kind of old hat, and because a lot of people have said for a long time, let's focus on the end users. But I think it's more than that. It's not just focusing on the end users, it's about embedding research into adaptive processes, which requires change of mindset, both from scientists, as Malcolm was saying, actually don't just ask them for a letter of support right at the end of your process, but also from the end users. They have to want to bring people with those technical skills, independent academics, into the process right from the beginning as well. So from both sides. And as many people who are in both sides as possible so that you can actually do that. Okay, so I was supposed to talk about methods, and most of this hasn't been about methods. So here's some methodological messages for the end. So the first message is, so many people find an exciting new method, and they read about this method, and they think, I want to try that method. And they come to me saying, can I try that method for something? That's not the way to do it. So you focus on the question, you focus clearly on the question and who it is you're trying to answer it for, and then you'll get some methods. So the methods derive from the question, the end user, the way you want your evidence, rather than the other way around. On the other hand, there's a range of different exciting methods out there. You should be creative and imaginative in the methods you use. Use mixed methods. That's another mantra that everyone says, but it's really true. To approach your question from different angles, even if you want to become the kind of embodiment of interdisciplinarity, it's still really good to work with a range of different people from a range of different disciplines because it will open your mind. And think beforehand about what evidence you need and not post hoc. Thank you.
Thank you, EJ. Do we have any questions, please, for EJ?
Good morning. Ollie Watts from the RSPB. I was just struck by your 5 outlined points as how important those are in tackling climate change. And we tend to think of ourselves very much in a static world as we're moving more and more to a very dynamic world where we don't know the future. The idea of modelling, participative research, predictive research and more experimental stuff is even more important than perhaps it ever has been or we've ever thought it would be. Any comment on that?
Great question. I'll buy your pint later. I agree. So these kinds of approaches are more important in a dynamic world, both a socially dynamic and environmentally dynamic world, more and more. And I think this whole approach of thinking forward rather than just monitoring backwards is going to become more and more important.
Question down here, please.
Hi, Humphrey Crick again. I was just wondering, the research councils have a great role to play in fostering transdisciplinary research. They don't seem to do it. What can we do to change that? Bringing end users much more into the whole research council process would be a really good idea, but I'm not sure they really take it very seriously at the moment.
I think some of them are trying. So the ESPA program, for example, the NERC ESRC DFID ESPA program was trying to do that. I think it's probably succeeded to some extent, or it still came from the science end, I think. In fact, in the UK, perhaps the fact that for people working internationally, the fact that DFID has got all the money has been quite helpful because they're having to talk to them. I agree that there's a long way to go. I did just get, in 25 years as an academic, get my first NERC Blue Skies panel research for a bit of social science with Aidan Keane up there. So it can be done. So I suggest to everyone, put your interdisciplinary work into the NERC Blue Skies panel. It might be better now.
Thanks, that was a super talk. Thank you very much. I was just thinking about some of the kind of the practicalities of the approach that you're advocating there, which I totally agree with. Depends a lot on how you define the system and where you draw the boundaries around that and so on. And often people will say, well, of course we should involve people in co-designing and co-producing the work, but we just haven't got time to do it this time. in some other time we'll do it. And so we keep sort of, particularly when resources are tight, we just go back to our old habits and what we know, and basically what we know doesn't work, but we still do it because it's all we've got time to do. I just wondered if you kind of offer any comment on that.
I really agree with you about that. And I think, first of all, it takes time for academic and implementing organisations to build trust. I think trust was mentioned yesterday. So you do have to build some kind of understanding between each other about what expertise and what money people can bring, because academics can bring that money and that time that perhaps implementers don't have. And if you start to think about things well in advance, I mean, it's years. It's not, you can't just do it it's like once you're thinking about your proposal, it's too late, really. So I think there's a process, and we need to start doing it. We need to start thinking about it, because unless we move away from that kind of firefighting thing, we're not going to make things better. So it's just like we were talking about policy yesterday. It's going to take 10 years to get to the situation in which you can have scientists, local people, and implementing organisations co-producing knowledge and working together. But if we start now, we'll get there.
Thanks. And we've got our final question from a gentleman at the back.
Mark Bergman, University of Melbourne. Thanks very much for dealing with such a difficult topic so comprehensively. I wondered, the methods such as the grounded methods that emerge in social science and purposeful sampling and other techniques that aren't as common in mainstream ecology, for example, sometimes sit uncomfortably with the paradigms of falsification and causation and experiment and manipulation. What's a journal editor, for example, to do with reviews of this work that can be in stark contrast? How do you resolve those differences of opinion about what's proper and what isn't?
Yeah, it's great. So I'll answer the question first with just a comment about those different kinds of evidence. And I think that comes back to who you want it for and what you want it for. So subjective evidence about how people are perceiving. So for example, with Tom Clements's work, those effect scores were against a valid control. So they were against people living in forests a long way away. What the local people thought about that effect size, about whether their well-being was improved or not, was calibrated against a non-valid control. It was calibrated against the people in the buffer zone who were having lots of roads and schools and things like that. So if you wanted to know whether local people felt good about the conservation intervention, you had to think about what their control was, not the valid control that you might have statistically. So different kinds of evidence for different kinds of people. And then in terms of journals, I think you just need to get the right expertise on the board and make sure that the editors have the expertise to know who to send stuff to.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. A round of applause again, please, for both speakers.